Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question that is honestly kind of unsettling. How can we tell if a confession is the real deal or if it's bogus?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and uh, to help us unpack it, we're diving into the psychology of interrogations and confessions
Hmm.
by Gisli H. Gudjonsson.
This book is like a Bible for folks in criminal justice and psychology, right?
Absolutely. It's considered a foundational text, and for good reason. Gudjonsson really gets into the nitty-gritty of what can make someone confess, and it's not always about whether they actually did it.
That's what I find so interesting. Like someone could be totally innocent but still end up confessing.
Exactly, and the book mainly uses cases from British courts, but the psychology behind it also applies everywhere.
So what we learned today could help anyone listening, figure out if a confession they hear about is legit or not, whether it's on the news or even just, something you hear from a friend.
Exactly, and you might be surprised by how tricky it can be to spot a false confession.
Hmm.
They're not always as obvious as you might think.
Okay, so to start us off, can we just get clear on the difference between an interview and an interrogation? I feel like those words get used interchangeably sometimes.
Yeah, they do, but there is a subtle difference.
Hmm.
An interview is more about gathering information in general. It could be with witnesses, victims, even suspects, and the questions are pretty open-ended.
Whereas an interrogation is more about zeroing in on a suspect and trying to get them to confess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as Gudjonsson points out, the lines can get blurry sometimes, and that's where things get really interesting.
And this is where the whole idea of coercion comes in, right? Like, there's this need to get information from suspects, but you don't want to push them into a false confession.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance, and one technique that often comes up in this context is the Reid technique.
Ah, yes, the Reid technique. I've heard about this. It's like a 9-step model that some law enforcement agencies use, right?
Right, and it can be pretty effective, but it's also pretty controversial.
Because it's so effective.
Yeah, basically, it's based on this idea of minimizing and maximizing. So they downplay the moral consequences of the crime while really hammering home the evidence against the suspect.
I see. So it makes confessing seem like the easiest way out.
Exactly. And while it can be effective, critics argue that it can be super manipulative and increase the risk of false confessions, especially from people who are already vulnerable in some way.
Okay, so that brings us to the big question. What makes someone vulnerable to these kinds of tactics? Because it's not like everyone would react the same way in an interrogation, right?
You're absolutely right, and that's where Gudjonsson's work is so valuable. He digs deep into the individual factors that can make someone more likely to confess regardless of whether they're actually guilty.
One factor that really stood out to me was low intelligence. The book mentioned a study where they tested the IQ of a bunch of detainees, and the average was way lower than expected.
Right, and that's a huge red flag because it suggests that the police might be interviewing and even interrogating people with intellectual disabilities without even realizing it.
And that obviously has massive implications for the fairness of the whole process.
Absolutely. It's not just about intelligence. Age can also play a role. Younger suspects can be more susceptible to influence, especially if they're dealing with other issues.
But it's not like all young people are easily swayed, right? Some teenagers are super confident and wouldn't crack under pressure.
Right, you're absolutely right. Age isn't the only factor. Someone older, but really anxious or easily intimidated could be just as vulnerable.
Makes sense. So it's more about the interplay of different factors.
Exactly. Context is everything.
Another factor the book brought up was drug and alcohol use. It said that recent drug use was actually one of the strongest predictors of a confession.
And it's not just about wanting to get out of custody quickly. Either withdrawal symptoms can seriously mess with someone's ability to think straight. They might be anxious, paranoid, even hallucinating.
So it's like they're not really in control of their own thoughts and actions.
Exactly. Which raises a really important question. Are people going through withdrawal even fit for interview, let alone interrogation? It's a bit of a legal and ethical gray area.
It's starting to feel like almost anyone could be vulnerable under the right circumstances.
That's a good observation. And we haven't even gotten into personality traits yet, things like suggestibility or compliance.
Okay, break those down for me. What do you mean by suggestibility?
So suggestibility is basically how easily someone is swayed by leading questions, especially when they're under pressure. Some people are just naturally more suggestible than others.
I can see how that would be a problem in an interrogation.
Exactly. And then there's compliance, which is kind of this deep-seated desire to please authority figures, even if it means going against your own best interests.
So someone who's super compliant might confess just to make the interrogator happy.
It's possible. And then you added anxiety, which, let's face it, being interrogated by the police is going to make almost anyone anxious. And you've got a recipe for a potential false confession.
Wow, so it's like a perfect storm of vulnerabilities.
You got it. And unfortunately, as we'll see, these factors have played out in real cases with some pretty devastating consequences.
Speaking of real cases, you picked out a couple of examples from the book that sound really interesting. Let's dive into those.
Okay, so let's start with the case of Stefan Kisko. This guy was actually wrongfully convicted of murder based on a false confession.
Oh, wow, that's awful.
Yeah, his case is a prime example of how individual vulnerability and police misconduct can lead to a complete miscarriage of justice.
So what made him so vulnerable?
Well, he had this condition called hypogonadism, which
Hmm.
basically means his body didn't produce enough testosterone, and that led to some developmental delays and a kind of naivete that made him particularly susceptible to authority figures.
I see. So he was more likely to just do whatever the police told him.
Yeah, and during the interrogation, the police were relying on this special knowledge that they claimed he revealed, but it turned out later that they'd actually withheld scientific evidence that proved his innocence.
Oh my gosh, that is so messed up.
It is, and sadly, Kisko spent 16 years in prison before his conviction was overturned.
That is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how easily things can go wrong, even when a confession seems legit on the surface.
Okay, so that was a case where the suspect was clearly vulnerable. But what about someone who seems, more normal? Can they still be manipulated into a false confession?
Absolutely. And for that, let's look at the case of Engin Rakip. He was one of the Tottenham Three, falsely accused of murdering a police officer during the 1985 riots in London.
Okay, so this was a high-pressure situation to begin with.
Exactly. And Rakip was actually illiterate and struggled with anxiety, and he had this strong desire to please authority figures.
So he was basically ticking all the boxes for vulnerability.
Exactly. And he ended up confessing to the murder, even though he didn't do it.
Wow. So even someone who's not, like, intellectually disabled can still be susceptible to these kinds of tactics?
Absolutely. And thankfully, his conviction was eventually overturned, thanks in large part to expert testimony that highlighted his psychological vulnerabilities.
So that shows how important it is to have experts who can explain this stuff to the jury, right?
Exactly. Because there might be things that the jury wouldn't pick up on just by observing the defendant.
Right. It's like they need that extra layer of insight to understand the full picture.
You got it.
Okay, so we've established that false confessions are a real problem and that there are a bunch of factors that can make someone more vulnerable. But how common are they really? Like, are we talking about a few isolated cases, or is this a widespread issue?
Well, it's hard to say for sure because there's no way to know how many false confessions happen that never get discovered. But Gudjonsson does highlight some research that sheds some light on this. One study looked at Icelandic prison inmates and found that 12% of them claimed to have given a false confession to the police at some point.
12%. Wow, that's higher than I would have guessed, and that's just the people who are already convicted. Who knows how many more are out there?
Exactly. It's probably just the tip of the iceberg. And this is where understanding the different types of false confessions becomes really important because they're not all created equal.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What kind of categories are we talking about?
So we've already touched on coerced compliant confessions, where someone confesses even though they know they're innocent because they're under duress.
Right. They might be tired, scared, or just desperate to get out of this situation.
Exactly. But then there's this whole other category called coerced internalized confessions, where the suspect actually comes to believe that they committed the crime.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It's wild, right? It usually involves something called suggestive questioning, where the interrogator feeds the suspect information, either intentionally or unintentionally. And if the suspect is already a bit unsure of their own memory, or maybe they're really eager to please authority figures, they can start to fill in those memory gaps with fabricated details.
So they basically create a false memory.
Exactly. And eventually they might even convince themselves that this false memory is the truth.
That is so scary. The book gave this example of Mr. R, who was suspected of stealing a purse, and during the interrogation, he started doubting his own memory and ended up confessing, even though he was totally innocent.
Right. And cases like that really show the danger of interrogation techniques that rely on manipulation and suggestion. Because if someone is already a little shaky on the details, it's so easy to lead them down the wrong path.
Wow. Okay, so we've got coerced confessions, both compliant and internalized, but what about voluntary confessions? Like, why would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit without any pressure from the police?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the reasons can vary widely. Sometimes it's about wanting attention or notoriety. Other times it's about protecting someone else, like
Got
taking the fall for a loved one.
I can see that, and sometimes people have a really strong sense of guilt, even if they didn't actually do anything wrong.
Right. They might feel responsible for something that happened, even if they were directly involved. Or maybe they have mental health issues that distort their perception of reality.
This reminds me of that whole recovered memory thing, especially in cases of alleged sexual abuse. It's like these false confessions are a kind of self-generated recovered memory.
That's a great point. You're absolutely right. Both false confessions and recovered memories can be heavily influenced by suggestive questioning and that human tendency to create a story that makes sense, even if the details are fuzzy.
So it all comes back to the fact that memory is not as reliable as we'd like to think.
Exactly. We have to be very careful when dealing with these kinds of claims.
Okay, so we've got this whole spectrum of false confessions, from coerced to voluntary, and it's clear that human psychology plays a huge role in all of this. But how does all of this play out in the legal system? Like, how do courts evaluate confessions, and what role does psychology have in those decisions?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated because legal standards can vary from country to country. In the UK, for example, the focus is on the reliability of the confession.
So the judge has to decide whether the confession is believable.
Yeah, basically. And they have the power to throw out a confession if they think it was obtained through coercion or if there's evidence that the suspect was vulnerable in some way.
And that's where Gudjonsson's work has been so influential, right? He's testified as an expert witness in tons of cases, explaining how things like suggestibility compliance and mental health issues can affect the validity of a confession.
Exactly.
Oh,
His research has really helped raise awareness within the legal system about the potential for false confessions and how to spot them.
the book talks about several big cases where psychological evidence was key in proving someone's innocence. One that stood out to me was the case of the Birmingham Six. These guys were wrongly convicted of IRA bombings based on confessions that turned out to be coerced.
Yeah, the Birmingham 6 case was a huge turning point. It exposed major flaws in the system and led to some important reforms.
Like what kind of reforms?
Well, one of the big outcomes was the implementation of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, or PACE.
Okay, so what does PACE do?
It basically introduced stricter guidelines for police interrogations.
Hmm.
Things like mandatory tape recording of interviews, ensuring the right to legal representation, and establishing clearer rules for how interrogations should be conducted.
So it's all about protecting the rights of suspects and reducing the likelihood of false confessions.
Exactly. It was a much-needed overhaul of the system.
But even with those safeguards in place, it seems like there's still this tension between wanting to get a confession and making sure it's genuine.
Absolutely. Legal safeguards are important,
Yeah.
but they can only go so far. We need a deeper understanding of the psychology involved to really tackle the problem of false confessions.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. It's not just about legal technicalities, it's about real people's lives.
Exactly, and it's about understanding that a confession is never the whole story. It's just one piece of a very complex puzzle.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problems with confessions, how they can be unreliable and how even innocent people can end up confessing. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about what happens after someone confesses. Like, how do the courts handle that information and what role does psychology play in those decisions?
Well, that's where things get even trickier. The legal standards for dealing with confessions can vary a lot depending on where you are.
Yeah.
Like in the UK, for example, they really focus on the reliability of the confession.
So the judge has to kind of decide if the confession seems believable.
Yeah, essentially. And they actually have the authority to completely throw out a confession if they believe it was coerced or if there are signs that the suspect was particularly vulnerable,
Yeah.
like we've been talking about.
And this is where Gudjonsson's work has been so important, right? Like, he's actually testified as an expert witness in a bunch of cases, helping to explain how things like suggestibility and compliance can make a confession unreliable.
Absolutely. His research has been huge in raising awareness within the legal system about the possibility of false confessions and, how to identify those red flags.
The book actually goes into detail about several landmark cases where psychological evidence was critical in proving someone's innocence. One that really stuck with me was the case of the Birmingham Six. These men were wrongly convicted of IRA bombings, and it all came down to confessions that were later found to be coerced.
Oh, yeah. The Birmingham 6 case, that was a major turning point. It really exposed the flaws in the system and highlighted the need for serious reform.
So what kind of reforms came out of that case?
One of the most significant outcomes was the introduction of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. or PACE for short.
Pacey. Okay, so what does PACE actually do?
It basically created a whole set of stricter guidelines for police interrogations. Things like requiring them to record the interviews, making sure suspects have access to a lawyer, and just generally establishing clearer rules for how interrogations should be conducted.
So it's all about protecting the rights of suspects and hopefully reducing the number of false confessions.
Exactly. It was a huge step in the right direction.
But even with these safeguards in place, it seems like there's always going to be that tension, right? Like the police need to get information, but they also need to make sure they're not coercing people into confessing.
You're absolutely right. Safeguards are important, but they can only go so far. You know, at the end of the day, we need a much deeper understanding of the psychology at play here to truly address the problem of false confessions.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so important, right? It's not just about abstract legal principles, it's about real people's lives being affected by these issues.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that a confession is never the whole story. It's just one piece of a much bigger and often very complicated puzzle.
Okay, so we've talked about the UK, but what about here in the US? Are there any similar concerns about the use of psychological evidence in court?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the big concerns is that judges sometimes feel like personality traits like suggestibility and compliance are things that jurors can already understand and assess on their own without needing an expert to explain it to them.
I can see that point, but it seems like those traits can be pretty subtle, right? Like someone could appear really confident and articulate, but still be easily manipulated.
Exactly. And that's where an expert can be so valuable. They can help the jury understand those nuances and see how those personality traits might have played a role in the confession.
And I guess another concern might be that psychological evaluations often rely on what the defendant says, which, could be biased or unreliable.
Yeah, that's a valid point. But a good evaluator would take that into account and look for corroborating evidence from other sources,
Yeah.
like family members, medical records, or even the police officers themselves.
Right. So it's about getting a holistic picture of the person and their circumstances.
Exactly. And there's this other concern that pops up sometimes, which is that if we allow too much psychological evidence in court, it'll undermine the whole idea of personal responsibility.
Like if anyone can claim they were too suggestible or compliant to resist confessing, then everyone will start using that excuse.
Yeah, it's that slippery slope argument. But I think it's important to weigh that against the fundamental principle of our justice system, the presumption of innocence.
Right. If there's evidence suggesting that a confession might be unreliable, we can't just ignore that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to take those concerns seriously. The pursuit of justice has to be paramount, and we can't let the fear of potential misuse of evidence prevent us from examining all the factors that might have contributed to a confession.
One thing that really struck me in the book was Gudjonsson's discussion of police impropriety. He doesn't shy away from highlighting cases where the police basically acted badly and contributed to false confessions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it happens more often than we'd like to think. We've seen cases where police use things like prolonged interrogation, sleep deprivation, and even physical abuse to try and extract confessions.
And even when it's not physical abuse, there are more subtle forms of coercion, right? Like the book mentioned cases where the police fabricated evidence or even hid evidence that pointed to the suspect's innocence.
Absolutely. And that's why transparency and accountability are so crucial. We need systems in place to investigate these allegations thoroughly and hold those responsible accountable for their actions.
And it seems like technology has a role to play here too, right? Like with more and more police departments using video recording during interrogations, we have a much clearer picture of what actually happened.
Oh yeah, video recording is a game changer. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a huge step towards transparency because when there's a clear, unbiased record of the interrogation, it becomes much harder to dispute what took place.
So it removes that he said, she said element. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time focusing on the negative side of confessions, the risks of false confessions and police misconduct. But let's not forget that true confessions are also an important part of the justice system.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the book does delve into the psychological factors that can lead someone to genuinely confess. And it's often a combination of internal pressures like guilt or remorse and external pressures like the weight of the evidence against them.
But even when a confession seems genuine, it still needs to be corroborated, right? Like we can't just take it at face value.
Exactly. We have to look for independent evidence that supports the details of the confession, especially in cases where there's not a lot of other evidence to go on.
That's a really important point. A confession alone, even if it sounds totally believable, should never be the only basis for a conviction.
I couldn't agree more. We have to remember that confessions are just one piece of a very complex puzzle, and it's up to the courts, with the help of experts when needed, to figure out how much weight a confession should carry in each specific case.
So far, we've mainly been talking about adult suspects, but what about children? I imagine they're even more vulnerable in these situations, right?
Oh, absolutely. Children, especially younger ones, are much more susceptible to suggestion. They have a harder time understanding their rights, and they're often really eager to please authority figures, so it's a whole different ballgame.
So what are some of the challenges specific to interviewing children?
Well, first and foremost, you have to use language that they can understand, avoid asking leading questions, and create a safe and comfortable environment for them. And, in cases of alleged child abuse, we have to be incredibly careful not to implant false memories. It's a really delicate balance between getting information and protecting the child from further harm.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a really sensitive situation.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that drug withdrawal can make someone more likely to give a false confession. What are the implications of that for interrogating someone who's going through withdrawal?
That's a really important question.
Hmm.
Withdrawal symptoms, both physical and psychological, can be incredibly intense. And research has shown that people in withdrawal are just more suggestible, more anxious, and they have a harder time thinking clearly.
So basically, they're in a super vulnerable state.
Exactly. And if they're being interrogated during that time, the risk of a false confession goes way up.
It seems like that's an area that needs a lot more attention, both from law enforcement and the legal system. We need to make sure there are safeguards in place to protect those suspects.
I agree. It's a serious ethical and legal dilemma. Can someone truly make a free and informed decision when they're battling withdrawal symptoms? I'm not so sure.
It's definitely something to think about. And speaking of safeguards, let's circle back to the issue of legal representation. The book really emphasizes how important it is for suspects to have a lawyer present during interrogation.
Oh, absolutely. Having a lawyer there can make all the difference. They can help the suspect understand what's going on, protect them from coercive tactics, and challenge the validity of any confession that's obtained.
And it's not just about having any lawyer, right? It's about having a good lawyer, someone who specializes in criminal law and understands all the ins and outs of interrogation techniques.
You're exactly right. And Gudjonsson makes a really good point about this being especially critical for vulnerable suspects. They might need extra support to navigate the complexities of the legal system.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the psychology of confessions, the legal framework surrounding them, and the challenges of introducing psychological evidence in court. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has. And, it's a conversation that I think everyone should be having because this stuff affects all of us.
I have to say, learning about all of this has made me question every confession I've ever heard about.
That's a good thing. It means you're thinking critically, and that's exactly what we want people to do. This deep dive isn't about assuming the worst of the police or saying that all confessions are unreliable. It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge to analyze these situations carefully and ask the right questions.
So the next time we hear about a confession, whether it's a huge case on the news or just a story, someone tells us, what should we be thinking about? What questions should we be asking?
Start with the context.
Yeah.
How old is the suspect? What's their mental and emotional state? Do they have a lawyer? Were there any language barriers or cultural factors involved? And then think about the interrogation itself. Were there any red flags in terms of the techniques used? How long did it last? What were the conditions like?
Those are all great points, and it seems like the main takeaway here is that a confession is never the whole story. It's just one piece of evidence that needs to be considered within the broader context of everything else we talked about.
Exactly, and that's where knowledge becomes power. The more we understand about the psychology of confessions, the better equipped we are to ensure that justice is served.
I have a feeling I'm going to look at confessions in a whole new light from now on.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
This deep dive might even inspire you to learn more about this topic, maybe do some research on the cases we mentioned, or even read Gudjonsson's book yourself.
It sounds like a fascinating read, albeit a little dense.
It is. It's definitely packed with information, but it's so worth it because at the end of the day, this isn't just about legal stuff or academic research. It's about understanding human behavior under pressure, recognizing the potential for error and manipulation, and advocating for a justice system that is both fair and accurate.
That's a great note to end on. Something we can all strive for, a justice system that truly works for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the world around you.
Wow, it really feels like we've just peeled back layer after layer on this topic. uncovering more and more complexity as we go. I have to admit, learning all this makes me wonder about every confession I've ever heard about.
That's kind of the point.
Mm.
This isn't about making us suspicious of every confession or thinking the police are always up to something. It's about giving us the tools to think critically and ask the right questions.
So, okay, next time we hear about a confession, whether it's a big news story or just, something from a friend, what are those key questions we should be asking ourselves?
Well, I think the first thing is to zoom out and consider the whole context. Like how old is the person who confessed? What kind of mental and emotional state are they in? Did they have a lawyer? Were there any language barriers or cultural differences that might have played a role?
And then we should think about the interrogation itself, right? Like, were there any red flags with the way it was conducted, how long it lasted, the conditions, that sort of thing.
It's exactly. Those are the questions that can help us move beyond just, knee-jerk reactions and really engage with this issue in a thoughtful way.
Because as we've seen, a confession is never the whole story. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it has to be viewed alongside all these other factors.
And that's where understanding this stuff really matters. The more we know about the psychology of confessions, the better we can advocate for a justice system that's fair and accurate.
I know, I'm going to be looking at confessions a lot differently from now on.
That's great to hear. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to keep digging, maybe do some research on the cases we talked about, or even check out Gudjonsson's book. It's a dense read, but super insightful.
Yeah, I might just have to add that to my reading list.
You won't regret it, because
Yeah.
ultimately this isn't just about legal technicalities or academic research. It's about understanding how people behave under pressure. Recognizing the potential for mistakes and manipulation and pushing for a justice system that truly serves everyone.
That's a powerful message and a worthy goal. A justice system that works for everyone.
Absolutely well said. And on that note, I just want to encourage everyone listening to stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the world around you.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.